Hi everyone and welcome to Axel's Classics, a podcast about amazing classical music. Maybe you love the genre, but you would like to learn more about the background of the pieces, or maybe you don't know any classical music at all and you're just looking for a place to start. Well, you've definitely come to the right place, and I hope that together we can enjoy some beautiful music. Today we hear what seems to be a symphony in the style of Mozart and Haydn, classicism, straight out of the 18th century. But soon enough you can notice the differences, the modern influences, which are completely in contrast with that original 18th century classicism. The year is 1917 and Prokofiev has just written what is considered to be the first example of neoclassical music. Neoclassicism in music was a reaction to the existing musical styles at the time. On one hand, Romanticism was so evolved that pieces were full of complex emotions, all in a very stretched format. Think, for example, of the huge symphonies by Gustav Mahler. On the other hand, there was a modern style, modernism, which sometimes completely let go of any existing format, or even tonality, which can make the music much less accessible, more difficult to listen to. So, as a reaction, neoclassicism brought back the structure, the transparency, and the clear emotions like Mozart and Haydn did 150 years earlier. A big name in neoclassicism is the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky, who wrote in this style in the 1920s. But for Prokofiev, this first piece in the new old style was actually an exercise. He wanted to practice to compose without using a piano. Nowadays, composers mostly use music notation software. Basically, you input notes into a program and it can be instantly played back to you. It's a very handy tool, but on the other hand, it's also a very valuable exercise if you can compose without the use of this software or without the use of a piano. Knowing all this, a big contrast can be found in Prokofiev's First Symphony. It has the appearance of a Haydn symphony, being mostly based on it, but Prokofiev modulates much more freely. Remember from previous episodes that modulating means moving from one musical key to another, so sometimes moving away from the starting key, the home base, and sometimes also to come back to it. If we look at Prokofiev's musical activity at the time, it's not surprising at all that he modulates in such an unusual way. At the time he was a well-known pianist and he performed a lot of his own compositions, and those were full of these modern influences, like for example chromaticism, meaning that you connect notes using the smallest possible steps between them, like this. Or dissonance, which means deliberately creating a lot of tension by playing two or more notes that harmonically don't really fit together. More proof that he was a modern musician is the fact that he performed the Russian premiere of a piece by Arnold Schönberg, Drei Klavierstücke, 3 pieces for piano, which was the first piece to completely move away from tonality. Tonality, the very thing that creates this balance of tension and rest in music. But maybe that concept and the composition require an entire episode dedicated to it in the future. Something even stronger than talking about all these musical concepts is of course hearing them. Let's listen. Already at the very beginning of the piece we get a few surprises. It starts with an old composition effect called the Mannheim rocket, which means that the strings rise up and play a big crescendo, gradually getting louder very fast. Then we hear the first theme. Then the same melody but in another key. Then part 2 of the first theme. And again the same, but in a different key. And you could also hear that each melody starts with an outburst of the orchestra. So here we have a lot of key changes, a lot of these modulations. And normally there are a number of logical keys to modulate to, but Prokofiev always chooses the unexpected ones. It's a really good example of this modern music in an old style or an old format. Then we get a second theme, and this one has kind of a typical structure which is very similar to the rondo form. It always comes back to the first part. So we start with part A, then it goes to part B, back to A, go to part C, back to A, to part D, and so on. Here's A. Then there's B, back to A, then part C, back to A, then part D. After that, the exposition ends. And I hope you remember from the previous episodes about the Brahms overtures, this structure of the sonata form. Then you'll know that the exposition presents the themes and the melodies, and that the development uses that same musical material to create variations and transitions. So here indeed is a variation on the first theme, this time in the minor key and with even more unusual modulations, key changes. And then a variation on the second theme, played by the horns, but this time it's much stronger and louder than the first time we heard it. Then a transition to again a Mannheim rocket, just like at the beginning of the piece, which makes clear that we have arrived at the next section, the recapitulation. And this section is basically a shorter version of the exposition, again with those surprising key changes. So, in general, a lot of references to original classical symphonies, but definitely with some more modern choices and techniques. The second movement has 3 notes per bar, which in music we call a triple meter. Now you might know the word meter from Latin or Greek, or metrum, as basically the rhythmic structure of a sentence or a verse in poetry. So here in the music you can hear 1 heavy beat and 2 lighter beats. And the violins have already started a high melody. And we are getting to my absolute favorite moment in this piece. What I like so much is that the rhythm, the melody, and the harmony are working together to push the music each time higher and higher. It gives me a kind of elevated feeling. I'll tell you when it comes back later in the movement. A new theme has started, and this time it has short notes. And slowly you can hear those notes going up, also getting louder each time, what we call a crescendo in musical terms. And that leads to a small climax. But what ends this part is again that beautiful moment of the music each time being pushed higher and higher, this elevated feeling. Here it is again. And the movement ends like it began, simple, sober, in the very clear triple meter. The third movement is the shortest and also the most traditional. It's a French gavotte, a type of dance, with 2 themes, and they are presented in an A-B-A structure. Here is theme A. It's quite a heavy melody that really gives the opportunity to the conductor of the orchestra to let it move, to play it as musical as possible. Then theme B starts. And here we return back to A, the first theme. But it's a much more intimate, lighter version. In a way, the fourth movement is very similar to the first movement, also making use of the sonata form, so with the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. A difference here is that the exposition gets repeated, note for note, which was actually a rule in 18th century classicism. Also, the atmosphere is very similar to the first movement. Very active, fast notes, a lot of notes, accents, quick dynamic changes, those unusual modulations, the key changes. And to really soak it all in, I encourage you to listen to the full symphony. It's only about 15 minutes, so very accessible, very easy to listen to. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Axel's Classics. If you have any questions, feedback or suggestions, you can always comment them here below the video. And also make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you next week.